Nancy Levinson said that if you do a deep enough investigation, you actually find yourself at a point where you simply don't have anyone or any single thing to blame. And yet, you end up with something that is far more useful, which is several opportunities to fix the system. And the good thing about these opportunities is that when you fix the system, you're not preventing only one type of accident from happening. You're preventing several.
Hey, and welcome to the Electrical Safety Podcast. I'm your host, Jon Travis, and today I'm speaking with Lucca Filippo. Lucca, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm happy to be here.
No, it's a pleasure. Just to kind of get things rolling, why don't you give us a bit of your background? I'm always curious just how people kind of ended up where they are today. And you can go as far back as you want and take as much time as you want. We got lots of time here. So, how'd you end up in safety and aviation and kind of doing what you're doing today?
Sure. Well, I'm originally from Rio, Brazil. So that's where I got my my helicopter pilot's license. So that's kind of where it all began. And I got really lucky because back when I was doing my flight instructor rating, working on flight training on the side, Brazil was going through this key moment for aviation safety. Because what was going on is that our aeronautical authority was starting to require safety management systems from what we call Part 91 operators, so the general aviation. So the airlines already had safety management systems, and now they're starting to require SMS for the rest of the aviation segment. And because of that, I ended up taking a lot of courses in safety management systems, risk management, human factors. So I became qualified in the topic really fast, taking advantage of this moment because there's a lot of conversations going on. There's a lot of training being given for free.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a massive opportunity. So when I completed my flight training, I did a little bit of sightseeing as a pilot. And then I soon started as a safety manager for a small flight school. So I had that experience. It was, it's like in safety, there are things that, you end up having to experience because then it makes it easier for you to understand the things you don't want to see anymore, right? So it's not
Yeah.
only about positive experiences, unfortunately. But it was a great learning experience. So that kind of solidified all this knowledge I'd acquired in the years before. And I started my safety career. So from then onward, and just to shorten things up, I moved to Europe, and then I started working as a safety investigator and also safety training and promotion specialist for a large business aviation group.
Mm-hmm.
Did that for a number of years. And then a couple of years ago, I moved to Edmonton in Canada, where I did my master's in risk management. So this was actually a separate field. I was doing, I was investigating safety and risk management as done in biological research, which is a completely different field to mine. But I think what was fun about it was finding ways how to apply my aviation safety knowledge to helping, this other high risk industry improve and better manage their risks. So I did that for a couple of years. We'll have to, finish up my thesis, but, essentially the program is done. And recently I moved to Luxembourg in Europe. And now I'm Chief Aviation Risk Officer for a business aviation group here.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah.
it's impressive. So that's interesting. I didn't realize when you went to Edmonton, and that's kind of a completely different, like you said, completely different field almost, but you're tying it together with risk.
Exactly.
I guess like for people listening, because when I hear the word risk management, like you can think like really small down to a single job, but then you can also think corporately or globally or something like that. So I guess just for for people listening, like when we're talking about risk management, what does that really mean? What does that mean to you? You're just kind of giving that overview of what it is.
Okay, sure. It's one of those questions that are so, you deal with it every single day, and yet you rarely stop to think about it.
Yeah.
You just do it, and yeah. So I think risk management is about acknowledging real life. It's about acknowledging that the things that we're going to be doing as an organization, even as a person, is never going to be risk free. And for that reason, what we have to do is to implement controls into our system. And that's where risk management comes along, because it starts with an appreciation of the hazards and risks that you're subjected to through some sort of risk assessment. And that
Hmm.
helps you understand where you should be controlling your system better. And then that's where we jump into risk management, which is understanding the controls that we need and actually putting things into place to ensure that we remain safe. um yeah, and that's basically the idea, and it's a cycle, right? Because you do something, the whole PDCA cycle. You do something, and then you have to make sure that the things that you did, they keep working, they're still effective, and even if they, also think if they haven't introduced new hazards into the system. The risk management never stops. It's an ongoing process,
Hmm.
and as I said, it's starts by acknowledging, reality, real life.
Okay. And would you say that it's um, like it also touches every part of the organization? So if you're going to start thinking about risk management, maybe it just starts at the corporate office, and everyone's like, oh, we really got to focus on this. But then eventually, it's going to get down to the field level, and that's when they're in the field doing a risk assessment or something like that. And when we're talking about risk management, does that tie everything together like that? Does that make sense? Or
It does, and I would argue that risk management actually starts. Well, okay, it's like, well, where does safety start? Okay, you
yeah.
can argue both ways, but I'd say um, most of it does start from at the front line, because even though we might not be doing things exactly how they're prescribed by regulations or best practices, there is already some sort of risk management going on. So I think the starting point of risk management is understanding how are people already doing it, right? And finding what's good and bad about what they're doing, and trimming the rough edges, but at the same time reinforcing the good practices that are already in place. So I think that's where the top part of the organization comes along, which is acknowledging where the gaps are, but also where the opportunities are, so we can further strengthen them. Yeah.
So yeah, I was actually thinking about that earlier today. What drives people? Just as a side note, I was at an organization last week, and we they've been working through their safety program, and they've been trying to make improvements, and they've been trained, and they understand the risks and the hazards, and yet they're still having trouble with employees just wearing the basic PPE. It's like they just don't want to do it. And I was thinking about, like, well, what if there were no rules at all? What if we had no rules? What would they do? Like, would people still, maybe this organization would be the same, but
Yeah. Yeah.
if there was no, like, uh, governmental rules and things
Yeah.
like that, like, would people still,
Be safe.
we still know about the risks?
Yeah. Yeah.
You think back, like, you picture those, like, pictures from the mines, and the guys are crawling around, they're covered in black soot, and that maybe they just didn't realize the risk they were at. But let's imagine that we understood the risk. What is it that you think that drives people to still want to like do the right thing and mitigate those risks, like without being told that they have to do it?
Yeah. Well, I think it comes down to, the sort of reward system that you've got in place, right? So what's if you do things the way they're meant to be done, what's behind this decision? Is it a sense of self-preservation? Is it some sort of encouragement from leadership, right? So there are things that motivate you towards, um, desirable behavior from an organizational standpoint. You know, I think ideally, most of the things that drive you towards good behavior should be intrinsically motivated.
Mhm.
I think good leadership is the one that does that, makes people want to you know do the right thing. But going back to what you're saying about rules, yes, a system, in order for it to be safe, you have to design constraints into the system, right? So there has to be a safety margin. There has to be a line where you tell people never go beyond this line, right?
Mhm.
How you do it? Well, there's several ways you can do it, but I think rules are still important. And I was listening to this podcast the other day, this other podcast, um, Punk Rock Safety, which is pretty popular these days, and
Mhm.
they're talking precisely about rules. And um, what I really like is that they said that rules, um, they also help decision making, right? So, like speed limit, the example they used. Sure, you got to be aware that something bad, might happen to you if you, exceed the speed limit. You might get a ticket, obviously, but it's not only that. It's because, you know, one day the speed limit for that, part of the road was chosen, right? For some reason that you now, driving under rain or whatever conditions,
Mhm.
you now don't appreciate, but there was some thought process going on behind that, that speed sign. So, so sometimes we choose to respect these limits simply because you don't know what happens to you if you go beyond it. And I think that's something that we not struggle a lot, but we have to deal with a lot in aviation because, well, you can imagine an airplane or helicopter, right? It's full of limitations, right? And our philosophy is that the moment you exceed a limit, you're chartering into the unknown. You become a test pilot, which is a position you never want to find yourself with.
Mhm.
You know, you are a test pilot. So rules limit, but at the same time, they help and guide you.
Mhm.
So
No, that's good.
we went off topic there, but
No, that's great.
yeah.
There is no topics here. Um, so you mentioned that you spent some time thinking about accident investigations. Um, what do people often get wrong about accident investigation? Like what?
Hmm. I think um, not going far enough into the organizational aspects, into the system contributions to an incident or accident, um, because it's so Nancy Levinson said that if you do a deep enough investigation, you actually find yourself at a point where you simply don't have anyone else. You simply don't have anyone or any single thing to blame.
Mhm.
And yet, you end up with something that is far more useful, which is several opportunities to fix the system. And the good thing about these opportunities is that when you fix the system, you're not preventing only one type of accident from happening, you're preventing several. So the farther we move beyond human error and the immediate aspects of an instance where someone or something failed, the closer we get to opportunities to really improve the system, to really make a positive impact on safety. So where I think people make most mistakes in safety investigations is is, stopping their analysis right around, they find human error.
Hmm.
Um, and there's numerous reasons why people do it. Well, it's satisfactory for once, right? So it's you found something, so it seems like your work here is done.
Hmm.
And then blaming people is something that is somehow programmed into us as a species, right? So
Hmm.
we found the person who made the mistake, we identify their shortcomings, we blame them, we feel good, and then we conclude the investigation without actually solving the problem. um but yeah, so when we do that, we do nothing to really improve the system. So yeah, that's the biggest failure I see happening.
Well,
Yeah.
let me add. So here's a story. Um, this this was not an incident, but let's say it was a near miss,
Mm,
and I'm hearing this secondhand. So it was told to me, um, but maybe some of the details are wrong. But it doesn't matter. I'm curious. So where we kind of stopped,
mhm,
and I'm curious what questions you would ask beyond maybe what I asked. So the story was an electrician was called to do a lockout
mhm,
for a mechanic who was working on a pump. The electrician assumed that the pump only had one lockout point, and apparently there was two lockout points, and you could switch how this pump was fed. And he didn't know about that. And the drawings of like the schematics of how this was wired was also not showing that there was two. So at some point in time, someone had added this second way to turn on this pump and didn't update the drawings, and they didn't check, and on and on and on. So he found out afterwards, just through conversation with one of the other electricians, who said, "Oh, did you lock out both? Like the other guy knew about it and he didn't." And the work had already been done. No one was hurt, fortunately. Um, but so let's just assume that there was an incident and they found that, oh, well, here's the problem: the electrician didn't lock out both things. Um, where does your mind go? Like, what questions are you asking? Because we're talking about like the electrician is doing the job and maybe the schematic right there,
yeah, yeah.
maybe the lockout procedure, but then above that or past that, what else are you thinking about?
There's a lot of whys we gotta ask, right? Why was it not included in the drawing? Of course, why was the guy not aware? Well, it wasn't, you know, in the drawing, but I think that's just the the most preliminary facts about that near miss.
Hmm.
There's many more questions to ask, um, but basically all of them revolve around the question, and this is not me saying, I think it's Sidney Decker, like, why did it make sense for, those people involved, the electrician, the procedure designer to do what they did? You know, why did it make sense at the time for them to make the decisions they made? Um, and that should lead you down, this wide and rich investigative path where you have
Hmm.
the knowledge that's going to be, basically a gold mine for you to fix your system.
But I know that you wrote an article where you talk about how fixing the problem sometimes might make things worse. So let's assume that they go, oh, geez, we just have to redline this drawing and then we're all set.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
fix that problem. So just in general, kind of explain your thought process around how fixing problems sometimes doesn't necessarily do exactly what you think it might be doing.
Well, sometimes fixing it. Well, it all comes down to how you do it, right? So how are you fixing your problems? Are you just band-aiding your system, right? Or are you actually addressing, the contributing factors? Um, I think what I've come to learn in my career, and something that bothered me right from the start, and especially in aviation, but not only, but you'll see why in aviation this is a big deal, is that it's way too easy for people to resort to, when they're fixing an identified um, system weakness, right? It's way too easy for people to patch these things with new procedure or debriefing people, right? Tell them not to do it again, right? But then when you start looking into hierarchies of controls, and there's many out there, you see that all of these things have very little effectiveness, and yet they comprise most of the solutions that we're putting into place in response to identified problems. So fixing things in the wrong way, to me, means two things. One is not appreciating the fact that you might be introducing new hazards into the system. But it also means that you're not doing it effectively enough. Like you're just, throwing paper at people.
Hmm.
And that only makes them a little bit safer than they were the day before. Um, And the problem, I see in aviation, for example, and other high risk industries where you're dealing with these expensive and complicated and complex pieces of hardware, machines, whatever, um, is that it's so hard to change the hardware, which is the way to go, normally speaking,
Hmm.
right? Engineering controls or eliminating hazard by design, safety by design. It's so hard to change these things that we have to resort to, lower effectiveness.
Hmm.
That's a problem. Um, because yeah, and most of the time, that makes us feel good because we feel like we're doing something about the problem. But then the next question is, how safer are we getting? Right?
So, so yeah, you kind of made the comment that a lot of the things that we're doing doesn't really impact things that much, let's say. And as you're so the one question I have is, so you mentioned the hierarchy of controls. So does the effectiveness correlate with the harder ones to do?
Yeah, well, I agree so. Yeah, I think it's safe to assume that. Yeah.
Okay. And so so in your experience, like what are some things that people love to do, they love to implement, that you find are just not effective?
Procedures. I think that's by far the most ubiquitous example out there because it's simply you change a line in an SOP, you create even worse, you create a new SOP, uh, whatever. But then you forget that behind, and then yeah, that's another critical aspect because behind every SOP there's a system, or rather, SOPs should also be thought of as systems because there are the words on that piece
Hmm.
of paper, but then there's the training, there's the awareness, there's the communication, there's the assurance, right? So not only do we resort to these low effectiveness controls, but we don't appreciate all the other activities that surround that control that also contribute to their effectiveness.
You are right. It's very hard to like eliminate the hazard. It's hard to have the engineering controls put in place. And as you get, it's easy. Like it's easier to just buy PPE and say, "Here, give,"
So much
just
easier.
yeah, so much easier. So probably that's something that we're gonna have to live with because that's just the way it is. It's always gonna like
Well, yeah.
right. So then, is there is there anything that, because you mentioned training, awareness, You know, people talk about culture, and all I'm thinking here is if you have a person who understands those systems and how things fits together, then that person to me is much more likely to be safe than someone, the systems are there on paper, but they don't really know about it, or it's not being enforced. Or so, like, where does that human factor fit in? Have you
Mm.
thought have you thought that through?
When I hear that, I think of this concept, which I really like, and I was talking to my colleagues earlier today about it, which is, um, well, something in bow ties. There's this thing in bow ties called degradation factor, right? So for every barrier that you implement in the system, and bear in mind, a barrier can be like the person identifies the threat and adopts procedure XYZ to turn off whatever about it,
Mhm.
right? Um, Behind every barrier where there's human performance that behind every barrier that hinges upon human performance in order to work, there are important degradation factors that we should take into account. So degradation factors are those things that are going to, well, degrade the effectiveness of the barrier. So if we're talking about a human being doing something, there's so many physiological aspects, for example, that can play a role, like fatigue, uh, you know, lack of, whatever, nutrition,
Mhm.
and also a lack of understanding of the procedure, or, a confusing procedure. So there's many degradation factors, tied to each control that you implement in your system. And because we have them, you have to have something that's going to protect you against that degradation. And that's where degradation controls come into place. So it's a two, or, well, even, there are probably many more dimensions, but immediately when you think about it, there's two dimensions to your, to how you manage your risks. You're preventing bad things from happening, but you're also preventing the bad things the things that you put in place to prevent bad things from happening, from degrading, you know,
Mhm.
from becoming eroded with time. Um, so I think that's a good invite for us to think about barriers critically, not only in terms of effectiveness, but also in terms of their life cycle, right?
Mm.
How good a treatment are we giving these risk controls, right? Um, what's the effect of time and human performance on the effectiveness of these controls? So all these things to have to be taken into account.
Mm. So let's yeah, I hadn't heard of that concept before, so that's really good, and it makes a lot of sense and kinda answers some questions for me. Um, what so I don't know where I picked this up, and but why why do skilled workers sometimes feel proud of working around problems
Mm.
instead of raising them?
So there's a book. It's one of those bestsellers, management bestsellers, Drive, from Daniel Pink. So he talks about, so he gathers a lot of research on, well, essentially intrinsic motivation, right? And he says that intrinsic motivation relies basically on, like, three pillars. So it's about, purpose, autonomy, but also mastery, right? So when you feel a sense of purpose in what you do, that generates intrinsic motivation. And the same is true for, when you have the autonomy and independence to go and do it yourself, but also mastery. So if you do something, even working out, right? When you go to the gym and
Mhm.
you feel this sense of, I'm making progress here, that, has to do with mastery. And I think skilled workers, there's a lot about intrinsic motivation when it comes to what they do. A part of what they do is becoming better and better in, what they can do with their hands, or the decisions they can can make, and the quality of the service they provide.
Hmm.
Um, so and that can sometimes be a problem. Um, Because, well, case in point, there's a study by Amy Edmondson and her colleagues. So they looked at nurses in um, tertiary care hospitals in the United States, and they were analyzing how they went about fixing problems. Right? Did they resort to first order problem solving, which is like you fix something right now, and you carry on without reporting, without any sort of root cause? Or did they resort to second order problem solving, where they identified the problem, took their time to understand what was behind the problem, reported, investigated, and allowed the system to do something so that problem wouldn't happen again? And what
Hmm.
they found was this massive prevalence of first order problem solving, which is what they called fix and forget.
Hmm.
um, and one of the reasons nurses resorted to first order problem solving so much was because they felt pride by overcoming challenges and difficulties autonomously and independently.
Hmm.
So they had this sense of mastery, precisely because they did it themselves, and they overcame challenges. And that was detrimental to the safety of the organization, because you had these highly motivated, professionals, intrinsically motivated professionals, and yet a system that was failing to fix the its issues. And then
Mm.
the the problem becomes, surely they were motivated, and they felt a sense of pride and so on, but they also found themselves fixing the same problems every single day. So, that's something that we have to be mindful of. Sure, mastery is great, and it does ensure safe outcomes at times, but sometimes it doesn't. It does the very opposite. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really good. I hadn't thought about that before. I um was speaking with a group a couple of weeks ago, and one of the individuals would another electrical worker, he kind of said something along the lines of, like, I asked him the question, like, what are some things we can do to improve safety around here? And he knew what needed to be done.
Mm,
Um, but even in his own thought process, he kind of said, like, he didn't even know if he wanted to do it or not. Not
yeah.
that he didn't want to be safer, but he didn't. It was almost, and now it makes more sense almost, if this is what was going on in his mind, is that if all of those problems are fixed,
Hmm.
he's almost thinking, like, well, now what am I going to do?
Mm.
And he doesn't realize there's probably lots of other problems that are going to come up.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, yeah, it was kind of like, be careful what you wish for. He was thinking, I think.
yeah, yeah. In a way.
Yeah, and no, that's really interesting. So, what are some things that, if you're leading an organization, and you get a sense that you think this is going on, a lot of first order problem solving, what what can a leader do to help people, look deeper and start to change the way they behave and think about this stuff?
Mm. So what's driving first order problem solving? And there are things that we can say, that generally drives first order problem solving, which is lack of time, lack of resources, of fatigue, whatever. There's many reasons, but locally, like in your own context, why are people resorting to first order problem solving when they should be, stopping reporting and learning from the issue? So just like any other safety investigation, go beyond the obvious, right? Try to look
Hmm.
to the I like this term, the performance shaping factors, right? So what's shaping people's performance when they decide to resort to first order problem solving? And And, as leaders, go to the front line and, ask around and observe and be curious and talk to people, right? Um, I think that's the very first step you should take.
Hmm. And what are some, if you hadn't thought about this before, um, what are some things that so you're asking around, but what is it that you're looking for? Like, what are some things that maybe some tells that this is going on?
Well, I think repetitive issues, right? Issues that are not don't seem to be going anywhere. They
Hmm.
seem to be uh, part of the background, right? So like the color of the walls, they're just there. They're part of who we are, right? Those are usually good indicators. I think the hardest, the one of the issues with first order problem solving, fixing and forgetting, is that when you're fixing and forgetting things, right, you're also driving safety performance lower and lower because problems are not only, you know, being perpetuated, but they're also becoming normalized. So all of those, things that have the potential to cause worse outcomes are being integrated into everyday operations. So you kind of
Hmm.
stop seeing them. Again, they become the color of the walls.
Mm.
Till one day something really bad happens. So how do we break this cycle? I think it has to involve active engagement from leadership. And as I said, being curious and asking people what makes your life difficult. You know, what gets in the way of you doing your work the way you think it should be done, right? Um, how can we improve things, right? Or even from what they call a safety two perspective, right? Which is focusing on the positives and so on. So it's asking people, okay, so what are the things that get in the way? What are the challenges that you have to face every day? And how do you overcome them? Because when you ask this question, you usually get, either one of two things. People are either resorting to dangerous ways to overcome the problem, and that's the point where you should, intervene and control the system, right? Before something worse happens. Or you're going to learn that there's a better way to do something. And in the same way, you would, try and close a safety gap with mitigation and so on. When you learn that people are being creative and even safer than you thought they were being, incorporate that into your SOPs. So normalize, these positives.
Mm.
Mm. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And there's a couple of places I'm thinking about. Communication, the having the leader have those conversations is probably the first thing that they have to do because it's not happening, right? And then going in and it'd probably just be like peeling an onion almost because there's just so many layers to it. But you got to start somewhere. And no, this has been really good, Lucca. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Is there anything, anywhere that maybe you're speaking or anything you got coming up you'd like to share with people? We can link to it in the show notes.
Yeah. Well, it's probably a little bit too late right now, but that's fine. But in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be going to Verticon in Atlanta, Georgia. So Verticon is a vertical aviation conference. Uh, but I'm going to be teaching 3 sessions there that are not about aviation. It's about
Hmm.
safety, and I think anybody from any industry that would attend, they would find value and find the takeaways useful. But yeah, you can always find me on LinkedIn. I try to be as active as I can. Or if you ever come to Luxembourg, yeah, I'm around. It's gonna be easy to find me. It's a tiny country, so
Yeah. No, that sounds great. No, thanks again. And yeah, it was a pleasure.
thank you, John.